computer. Sounds risky, but it might work. Okay, I'm recording to this computer. And everybody, please welcome our guest speaker, a hydrologist from the National Weather Service, right here locally in Grand Rapids. It is Mr. Andy Dixon, a coworker of mine and a few other people on this call. Maybe you've seen him before, maybe he's new. Andy, go ahead and take it away. Introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Court and Kim and the whole club for inviting me, and thank you, Court, for the really generous $1,000 speaker fee that you offered later this afternoon. That's just really generous. No, obviously kidding.
It was my Powerball winnings.
Yeah,
I had to spend $30,000 to make $1,000.
Wait, you won $2 billion and all I get is 1,000?
Yeah.
Well, yes. On a serious note, thank you for the invite today, and I've met some of you I haven't. Just by way of brief introduction, my name is Andy Dixon. I am the hydrologist here at the Grand Rapids office of the National Weather Service. I've been here for, it's hard to believe, but I've been here in Grand Rapids for almost 4.5 years now. And so prior to this, I worked for the Weather Service in a similar position, but I was at the office in Anchorage, Alaska. And I had lived in Alaska for about 13 years, including some time in the military. And that's really where I discovered a love of, I came up as a meteorologist, but I crossed over to hydrology somewhere around 2014 and really have become enamored by this other half of the water cycle, and specifically river ice. And so the background picture you see that we've all been staring at for 10 minutes now. Also, I realize that I look oddly angry in that photo, so I'm not sure what's going on with that. But this is a picture of me standing next to blocks of river ice in Aniak, Alaska. And so obviously the winters are significantly harsh in interior Alaska. And if you can believe it, this is the actual natural thickness of ice that formed on this river. The Kuskokwim River is the name of this. So I'm not a midget. I'm about 6 feet tall. So you can tell that ice is pushing probably 8 or 9 feet thick. So very, very impressive. A lot of strength, a lot of power. So what I want to talk to you guys about today is just kind of a primer about how river ice forms, how our rivers freeze up as long as the weather's cold enough, and then talk about a couple different scenarios that result in ice jams that can and have happened on our rivers in Michigan. And so we'll go ahead and get started. I expect this will probably take about 20 or 25 minutes, and I hope and I think we should have plenty of time for questions. I love questions, and I also threw some videos in here. Obviously, we weren't planning on COVID or on Zoom. This feels like COVID again, and so I'm not sure, Court, if the videos, I've embedded YouTube videos, they may not work that well coming through all of the layers, but we'll see. You can let me know and give me some feedback. Just before I get rolling here, can you hear me all right? Or is it better if I hold the microphone like this? Or doesn't it matter?
We could hear you just fine normally.
Very good. Okay, well, away we go. Maybe. Okay. So I want to walk you through the process, and you're going to see stunning works of art that I've created in Google here. I want to walk you through the process of how river ice begins to form on the rivers. And so this is pretty much universal to Michigan, to Alaska, to anywhere in a northern climate that's cold enough for long enough for the rivers to start freezing up. And so what happens first is you start out with no ice. And so we can see our fake river diagram on the right there, water's flowing bottom to top. Importantly, we have similar conditions of water levels across large lengths of this river, upstream and downstream. So kind of a steady state. This is fall. This is maybe even like right now where there's no ice going on in the river. What starts to happen first is obviously it needs to get cold enough for ice to start to form. Now, a lot of folks might think, oh, that starts to happen magically at 31 degrees. Well, it turns out it actually doesn't. The reason for that is because a significant contribution of the water in the rivers is actually coming from groundwater that's discharging into the river channel itself. And in Michigan, in this part of Michigan, groundwater, like you would get out of your well, for example, I live out here in Lowell, and we're all on wells. The coldest the water will be is Court, your cat looks hilarious. The coldest water will be coming out of the ground in this part of the state is about 50 degrees. So what that means is that regardless of what's going on with the air temperature, even if it's below freezing, some amount of the water that's in the river is coming out as 50 degrees. And so that takes time to cool down. So that's why you don't start to immediately generate ice in the rivers at 31 degrees. You have to get sufficiently cold that you can overcome that kind of steady infusion of warmer water. And so what we see is that once the daily average temperatures drop down to about 20 degrees, so average temperature for a day being split the difference between the lowest temperature and the highest temperature during that 24-hour period. So let's say you are down at 15 degrees overnight and 25 during the day, your average temperature for that day would be 20. And that's about the magic number where we start to form pretty good amounts of river ice. And that is what initiates this process that we're going to be walking through right now. And so there's kind of two types of ice that form first. The first one is called border ice. I've shaded that in this aqua, I don't know, light blue type color, and it shows up and forms on the sides of the river first. And the reason it forms there is because the water is shallower and thus moving more slowly on the sides of a river generally. And so the water there is able to freeze first. It almost acts a little bit like a lake where the water isn't moving, so there's not so much turbulence in the water, and so you can form this steady called thermal ice. It can just start right along the banks and start growing outward or toward the middle of the river. So that's called border ice, and that's what you see in that blue aqua type color. That's a fairly slow and steady process as long as it's cold enough. What's more exciting to me is the orange dots that you see are a different type of ice. This is called frazzle ice. Frazzle ice, if you were to pick it up, I think I have a photo a little bit later. If you were to pick this up, it looks a lot like slush in your hands. This is small pieces of slushy ice that are tumbling and rolling and moving around as the water flows down the river, over logs, around rocks, swinging around the bends, things like that. So this frazzle ice is not confined to the sides or just to the middle of the river. It's tumbling all the way through the water, everywhere the water is moving. And as this goes down river, there's no ice jams at this point, and there's not even that much ice in the river at this point, but we start to see water levels increasing in our rivers, not significantly, but starting to increase. And that's purely just a function of the volume that is displaced by that ice. So it's very analogous to putting an ice cube in your glass of water. You push the actual water surface up a little bit just because you're using up some of that storage space with this ice that's forming. So at this point, we do start to get the beginnings of this water level rising. You can also kind of think of it like a pipe getting clogged, or it's a little morbid to think about, but like a vein getting clogged with like cholesterol and plaque and whatever. I'm not a doctor, but it's kind of beginning to constrict the channel. And so there's still water flowing freely, but we're starting a process that's going to potentially lead to some problems. And so here's kind of two pictures of each of these different types of ice. On the left side, you see that border ice really clearly. So there's probably also frazzle ice, although we can't see it from this distance. But as I mentioned, you see it basically growing symmetrically in toward the sides of the river from both of the banks. And so that is border ice. And then on the right side is frazzle ice. So whoever took this photo has obviously dipped their hand in, and it's basically slush. It's not that different than slush. there's a third type of ice that we tend to not see too much in Michigan, although I have seen it during, I hate to use the phrase polar vortex, but it seems to be a popular, commonly accepted phrase now. So when we do get into these really bitterly cold outbreaks, another type of ice that can form actually starts as this frazzle ice, but as those super cooled growing ice crystals are tumbling through the water, they act almost kind of sticky, and so they'll freeze to things and then start accumulating and pulling more of the frazzle pieces that are coming down the river after them. And so this anchor ice forms when those frazzle particles, as they're called, get stuck to maybe a submerged log or a rock or a boulder that's on the bottom of the river. They'll stick to that and then start growing, and then another little frazzle particle will tumble by and it'll get stuck to it as well. And so you'll see these form this, I don't know if hopefully it comes through on your image as well, but there's almost this pillowy, can you see my mouse, Court? Yeah, there's kind of this almost pillowy cloud-like appearance when you look down into the water and look down at this anchor ice. So this is rocks and features on the bottom of the riverbed that are covered with this, what's now called anchor ice. It's a very cool phenomenon. I have seen it on here, out here in Lowell on the Flat River, again, during these really cold mornings, before the river is frozen up, if we happen to get into a polar vortex type cold. And so as this happens, it's more of that same. It is more constriction of the river channel, more volume displaced, and so the water levels kind of keep steadily climbing up. Again, this is not an ice jam. This is a very natural process at this point, but we do predictably see the water levels starting to rise. Okay, as we march along in time here, we see the border ice, so that bluish aqua thickening up, growing closer toward that center of the river. And then we see the frazzle particles in the orange, but if it's cold enough, long enough, these frazzle ice particles will start to stick to each other, and as they grow a little bit larger, they'll end up, instead of tumbling through the water so much, they'll end up floating on the top of the water's surface. And so you'll notice they kind of start to look like, by the time you would usually see them on the rivers here, they kind of have a mostly circular, almost pancakey type appearance. And that's simply because as they stick together in these irregular shapes and then move through the flowing water, they bump into things, and over time the edges kind of get rounded out, so they take on this circular type appearance. So these are called frazzle pans. So it's just a kind of an evolved version, a level 2 version of frazzle ice process. So again, we're adding more and more ice into the river, so the water levels are continuing to rise. And I've denoted these frazzle pans with this amazing pink color. So here's an example of a couple of these different features. I took this is an example from Alaska, but it applies here as well. And so if I advance again, you'll kind of see, and maybe I'll toggle back and forth a few times. You can see a couple different features. You see this ice over here on the sides that looks more smooth and almost a little more uniform in texture and appearance. But then you get these discrete type features that are flowing. So the water, I didn't note it in this slide, but the water is flowing away from us. And so these smaller circular type features are moving with time. So actually I annotated them here on this next slide. And so you can see these two different types, frazzle pans or slush pans or pancake ice or whatever you want to call it. That's still moving at this point, but the border ice, of course, is not moving. Okay, next step. As it continues to be cold enough to make ice, but importantly, not when it's bitter cold. So this is like a reasonable amount of cold. This border ice continues growing in. Meanwhile, the frazzle pans are trying to go down the river, but of course the channel, the open water, is getting narrower and narrower. Meanwhile, these frazzle pans are also getting bigger and bigger. Well, you can see how this story ends. At some point, those frazzle pans are unable to move freely through the ever shrinking channel of open water in the middle of the river. And so at some point they stop. They kind of get stuck. It's like playing Tetris. They can't make it around the bends and keep moving. So eventually they stop. And this is a really important time on the rivers, because if the first type of ice jam is going to form, this is the point at which it's going to form. So this is a delicate and an important part. If you're standing along the river and you're watching these cool pans of ice go by, and as you're standing there over the course of a couple of minutes, the ice pans stop moving, that's when you want to pay attention. Because maybe it's going to go the way of this very natural process, or maybe it's going to result in an ice jam. So let's continue along. If this process is happening gently enough, so this is why I said on that previous slide, as long as it's not bitterly cold, if it's a typical wintertime weather pattern, and it's teens in the night and low 20s during the day, what will happen is the frazzle pans stop, but there's not so many and so voluminous of frazzle pans trying to go down the river that they pile up against each other. Instead, they just kind of gently come to a rest, and then this border ice is able to accelerate its growth toward the center of the river. The reason that happens is because once the frazzle pans are stopped, now the thinnest top layer of water is not moving that much, kind of like in the shallows on the sides that we originally talked about. And now, instead of making this slow plodding progress toward the center of the channel, it's able to kind of lurch to completion, where the two sides of the border ice meet roughly in the middle of the river. And so at this point, the water levels that have been steadily rising all along kind of plateau. If the temperatures hold at these reasonable levels, the ice will all of these two different types of ice will start freezing together into one solid canopy, we call it, of ice over the top of the river. And assuming that is able to happen without being interrupted by wild weather swings in the weather patterns, this results in the river arriving at a pretty stable, steady state. And so this doesn't happen every year in Michigan. Again, I've been here, this will be my 5th winter. I think it was 2019 and 2020, it was quite warm, I think, and the rivers basically didn't freeze. But most of the time, our rivers do freeze, and usually it will be this kind of gentle process like this. And so at this point, it doesn't matter how cold it gets. No ice is moving, and everything's going to be stable until we get the inevitable warm up, whether it's in the middle of the winter or in the spring. Eventually it's going to warm up, and so then that ushers in the second risk period. So this is the ideal. What I've described so far is the absolute ideal scenario for things to happen in a calm, predictable, measured pace. And here's an example of what the hydrographs, the river traces that we monitor, might look like during this type of process. So this is on the Flat River out here. I'm biased toward Lowell. It's always sunny in Lowell, and so I just love to use examples whenever I can. What we see on the left side of the image here is that the river started out with no significant amounts of ice in it. And so the water level was about the 4-foot level out at Smyrna. Then we were in a cold pattern. I don't remember exactly what the temperatures were, but this is that kind of ideal type pattern where the water does start to freeze, but not so fast that it causes an issue. And so we see a few little iterations of ups and downs, but mostly it's a fairly steady rise, and then it kind of plateaus here at this, it looks like about 6.5 to 7 foot level. And so at this point, it's that steady state. And so this is not an ice jam as much as it's just a kind of a normal freeze up process. So now we start talking about ice jams. There are 2 different types of ice jams that you're probably familiar with. There are freeze up ice jams, and there are breakup ice jams. Somewhat logically, the freeze up ice jams occur, if they occur during the process that I've described so far. So we had talked about the ideal. What would not be ideal would be a polar vortex where there is so much water or so much ice being made so quickly that it overwhelms the ability of the river to kind of sort through it. When the ice growth is in overdrive, this is what we're risking, is freeze up ice jams. An example of this would be, if any of you are familiar with the Rogers Heights neighborhood, it's just upstream of Rogers Dam on the Muskegon River. Freeze up ice jams happen in this location almost every year, very predictably. The alternative to a freeze up jam would be, you guessed it, a breakup ice jam. And this can happen anytime. Well, of course, it requires that the river has frozen up solid. This solid ice cover has to be the starting point. And then once you get the significant warm-ups, whether it's spring or some kind of big January or February thaw, that's when we start to get worried about breakup ice jams. But again, importantly, the river has to have been frozen over first before you can unlock the potential to develop a breakup ice jam. So the most recent example of a breakup ice jam in lower Michigan, you probably all remember the significant Portland ice jam of 2019. So I kind of already mentioned it. This freeze up ice jam, though, when it's really cold, like less than 10 degrees for high temperatures, during this vulnerable freeze up process, that's when the river is in overdrive. This is it's another, you can think of it also like the Tetris game. The river is trying to sort and organize these chunks of ice that are forming. But if they're coming too fast, when the Tetris game is getting to the top and the rows are coming faster and faster, at some point you just say, well, I give up, I lose. That's what essentially happens on the river too, when there's just so much ice coming down that it cannot sort it. It can't freeze over in a stable way in time. And so there's more ice just ramming in behind. So the first frazzle pans, the first pink shapes that you see in the diagram here come to rest. But then there's so many more coming in behind that it just keeps pushing in and pushing in and pushing in. And this is when things start to really thicken up. And this is where you really start to obstruct the ability of the river to continue passing water downstream. So whereas we have seen water levels slowly and steadily rising, this is when we see an inflection point and things start to go up more rapidly. Water levels start to go up more rapidly. And this is essentially an iterative process where a bunch of the frazzle pans pack in here. Maybe it kind of holds steady for 5 or 10 minutes or an hour. But then as it starts to build up more energy behind here, more pans of ice, and maybe even backing up a little bit of water that acts as a ramming force as well, it causes this delicate balance of those initial frazzle pans to collapse. And so now what's basically an ice jam now collapses in on itself until the forces balance again, and then a new ice jam starts to form. So this is a repetitive, iterative type process. And so this is what a freeze up ice jam really brings to the table. So this clogging of the pipe metaphor, this clogs it up even more, and the water levels can rise even more. If there's a silver lining to freeze up ice jams, it's that they tend to, and there's no guarantees in any of this, but they tend to not cause the catastrophic flooding that breakup ice jams do. Why is that? It largely has to do with the fact that usually when the freeze up process is happening, there's snow on the ground, there's not runoff. All we have is mostly the groundwater. So there's not that much water trying to go down the river. So that the forces involved in the whole river system are at their low point for the year when this freeze up process is happening. So because you have less water acting as a ramming force, it tends to limit how severe these ice jams can get when we're talking about freeze up jams. Again, no guarantees, but as a generality, that usually holds true. And so let's look at a few pictures and videos too. Freeze up ice jam. This is a picture that I took in late January of 2019, up on the Muskegon River. This is the bridge in Bridgeton. And so this is a freeze up ice jam. And so this water, none of the ice that you see in the water here is moving. When I arrived on the scene, everything was stable. But what you can see, and one of the important identifiers is if you hear about an ice jam and you could decide to go check it out safely, and decide to go check it out, one of the things that will be a unique identifier for freeze up ice jams is that the individual blocks of ice that you see in the middle of the river that are kind of jumbled and packed up, there will be a roughness to the texture, as you can see here, but it's not that significant. Maybe a foot or 2 feet tall total in terms of this jumbled mess that you see out in the middle of the river. And again, it's not moving. So what that means is that this ice, these are these fairly new frazzle pans that have packed together, and you basically have a giant slush pile floating on the top of the river. And so it hasn't had a chance to get that thick and strong yet. So it'll usually limit how rough the overall surface looks. Interestingly, we can also see this border ice right here on the sides. So that's that border ice that's been steadily growing out. And here, if you follow my cursor on the other side of the river, this is the border ice on the other bank that has been growing toward the middle. And so then all of this in the middle are frazzle particles that became frazzle pans that ended up plugging up and jamming together so quickly that they stopped moving. And now the river is basically freezing up into this stable spot. Unfortunately, it froze up so quickly that it basically became an ice jam here. So there was some flooding, but this was during the polar vortex of 2019. I think the temperatures were in the single digits. And if nothing else changes, eventually even this ice will freeze over totally solid and form a solid ice cover. Here's the first video. I hope that this is going to work well. This is one of my favorite videos. This is from up in Canada, the North Saskatchewan River. And so I'm going to push play on this, and it's going to run for about a minute, I think. Is that coming through all right, Court?
It's smooth on my internet connection.
Okay. So what we see here is border ice on the side. So that's not moving, but we do see these large frazzle pans that are moving down the river. And so you can see them flowing downstream, coming down from upriver. Yeah, they kind of get jockeyed around a little bit by the bridge piers here, but they mostly go. But watch what's happening right here. The freeze up, or the process is slowly backing up. I'm going to back that up just a little bit. It's all moving, and you see this. I'm going to pause it right there. You see at about this point now, these pans of ice are no longer moving. So this is the gentle process that we were talking about. This feature where my cursor is now is referred to as the freeze up front, a freeze up front of river ice. So somewhat counterintuitively, the freeze up front actually moves upstream as time unfolds. I'm going to push play again, and what you're going to see is one or two times where, recall that I said sometimes as the forces equalize, you get this collapsing and then a little bit of movement, and then it stabilizes again. We're going to see that show up. Watch, keep your eyes on the lower part of the river here. See how it shifted again and then found another stable spot. So that will happen. That's a normal natural process. Meanwhile, the overall freeze up front is slowly progressing upriver. So it looks like maybe at about this bridge, the ice sheets are no longer moving. And with time, this process, this freeze up front, just continues all the way upriver. Is that coming through okay? I know you said it's good for you, Court. Thumbs up from anybody else with their camera on if that's looking okay. All right, good deal. So this is technically would probably be considered a freeze up jam, but you've probably started to put the pieces together. There's a very blurry line between a river freezing up and a freeze up ice jam. It's mostly just a matter of degrees. If it happens in an orderly way, it's a normal process. If it happens too hastily, then we have to talk about freeze up ice jams. All right. Oh, I want to go to the next slide. Okay, here's another example. This is from closer to home. You've probably heard about the St. Clair River ice jams that happen almost every year when the water is when it's really cold. So this is from a couple years ago, and this is some news helicopter, media helicopter. taking this. So this is really cool footage. So obviously we see this is the riverbank here. There's a little bit of border ice we can see, but this is a big pan of that frazzle ice. And so this looks like there's a couple different pieces of individual ice in there. Yeah, that's how it formed. But at this point, somewhere upriver, all of this froze together into one big block. And so now when I push play, you'll see this whole thing is pinwheeling around like a large sheet of ice, all frozen together. But this end of it is bumping into the neighborhood and the ice on the sides. Watch this. And they're going to zoom in here and you'll see how it just is it's so impressive to watch and think about the forces involved. So if you've ever taken physics, it's essentially like a balance of forces diagram. The stakes keep going up as two pieces of as ice and a bridge pier, or ice and more ice. As things start to oppose each other, the pressure builds and builds and builds until one of those two breaks and gives up. And so that's what we were kind of seeing as that ice was grinding against the sides there. The more exciting and newsworthy and unfortunately dangerous variety of ice jams is the breakup ice jam. When we hear about significant ice jams, it's usually going to be breakup ice jams. And so, as I mentioned before, this always requires a stable ice cover. In Alaska, that's a no-brainer every single year. You're going to have the river's going to go into these stable, frozen over conditions for anywhere from 1 day in Michigan to 5 months in Alaska. But regardless, doesn't matter whether it's been 1 day or 5 months. Once it's reached that stable spot, that ushers in the potential for, at some point, we're going to have to get rid of this ice. And if that happens violently, it's going to be a breakup ice jam. So what usually happens is, and this will be mostly unique to Michigan now, or more applicable to Michigan, what will usually happen here is we'll get these polar vortex outbreaks in January or February. The river freezes over in quick order. It's so cold that the ice canopy is continuing to thicken. And then, because we live in Michigan and we all love rapid air mass changes and the atmospheric violence known as the mid-latitudes, we'll probably get this huge warm up and it'll be 70 degrees. Well, maybe not, hopefully not 70. 60 degrees, let's say. And oh, by the way, we're going to get 2 inches of rain as well. So what this does is it sets a process in motion that is eventually going to result in the destruction of this beautiful canopy of river ice that we've spent the whole polar vortex building. And it's personal side note, it feels like such a waste when we only keep ice cover for a week and then it goes away, but I digress. So what will happen is it'll warm up. So that'll start melting the snow that's on the ground. That water is trying to either soak into the ground. Oh, but wait, the ground is frozen, so it can't. So instead it starts flowing downhill toward the rivers. Meanwhile, it's probably also getting 2 inches of rain. That just adds fuel to the fire. So you have all this water that's trying to find its way to the river. And keep in mind, even once we have this stable ice cover, there is still water flowing through the rivers. Year round, there's water flowing through the rivers. It's just happily flowing underneath this canopy of ice. Well, what happens when we get all the melting snow and the rain and we triple the amount of water that is trying to go through that same river channel? Well, ice floats. And so what happens is the water finds its way into the bottom and starts pushing up on the ice from underneath just through buoyant force. And so there's a few rules of thumb for how we maybe can guesstimate how much of a rise has to happen before we can start breaking ice loose. Usually it's commensurate with if the ice in our part of Michigan is usually coming out of a polar vortex, you maybe have 6 to 8 inches of ice thickness in the center of the Grand River, for example. So our bottom rule of thumb here, when the amount of water rise that is trying to go through the river is about 1.5 to 3 times that thickness of the ice, that's when you can start to tip the scales and the buoyancy begins to break the ice up. So if we have an 8-inch ice thickness, we start down this road anywhere from a 12 to to 24 inch rise that is trying to go through the waters of the river, which is not really all that much. So that's why this tends to happen, unfortunately, pretty easily. And so the first thing that happens when we do start to increase this buoyant force is the solid sheet of ice now that is happily covering the river. Not sure why I attribute emotions to ice, but it just seems like the right thing to do. The first thing that will happen is the ice, you'll start to see these large cracks that cross the entire width of the river. They're called transverse cracks. And that's the first sign that the breakup process is beginning to unfold. And so this is on the left side, you have a picture that actually taken by me of the Grand River in 2019 in Comstock Park. I zoomed in on the right side here just to highlight the crack a little bit. But what this means is that we now no longer have one long continuous sheet of ice. We now have, well, in this case, we have two. They're starting to fracture and break apart. All of this ice, none of this ice is moving yet. It's all still stable, but this is step one. So just to describe this, they start to break up into huge pieces at first. So these are those first cracks that we just saw in the previous one. But as the process continues, those huge pieces of ice start to break up into smaller and smaller pieces of ice. So that's why I added these other little blue line cracks. So we're starting to slowly tip the scales on the teeter-totter, the force diagram. And at some point, the ice cover has lost enough strength that the whole thing goes mobile and starts flowing. Ice starts flowing downriver again with the current. Why is this a problem? If we had a straight river that didn't have any obstructions or bridge piers or anything like that, probably everything would just progress kind of nicely. Of course, that's not how the world works. It's not how the natural world works, and it's definitely not true when we build bridges and dams and things like that alter the natural course of these rivers. And so at some point, these large chunks of ice start to try to move, but they usually don't make it too far, and they do tend to get stuck at the same places over and over, year after year. So this would be narrow points in the river, so constrictions, makes sense. Sharp bends in a river, same kind of thing. It's hard for them to take that corner. Shallow spots. The shallow spots probably doesn't happen in Michigan so much, but in Alaska, like those big pieces of ice we saw, if you do get to a shallow spot, the bottom of the ice chunk can actually be grinding against the riverbed. So that can be the blockage as well. And then finally, the bridge piers. That's probably our most common trouble spot here in Michigan. And so here's what that process looks like. This is these big sheets of ice that are broken up into smaller blocks of ice. So these look small because this photo is taken from a helicopter, but these are still pretty good size, and there's still a pretty good amount of strength left in these sheets of ice. Like this one is, this is probably 50 to 75 feet long. This one here, for example. So this is like your Tetris game right here. You can see it plain as day. So these things are moving along, and inevitably, one of the big chunks can't make the corner. It gets stuck. It gets hung up on the bank, on the bridge pier, on something, and can't make it. So in this case, it's this big piece right here that can't rotate itself geometrically around this bend in the river, and so it's stuck. And so now smaller blocks, or big blocks too, but smaller blocks that are trying to move down the river behind this can't make it. And so they start pushing into each other, thickening that process, thickening the whole obstruction up a little bit. And what that causes to happen is backing up of water upstream of the ice jam. So as the ice jam starts to form, we talk a lot about flooding upstream of the jam, but the lesser known feature of that is that the water levels drop downstream of the jam. Well, that makes sense. The jam is holding back water, and so not as much is going through. So that's another warning sign if you decide to go sightseeing by ice jams. If you see the water, if suddenly you are not seeing ice flowing past you anymore, and then the water level starts to drop, that's an indication that an ice jam may have just formed upstream of you. So that's where upstream is where we'll see the water levels rise first, often significantly. And so the Portland ice jam, Portland, Michigan ice jam is a good case study here. This was a breakup ice jam, and all of us have probably spent time observing the Grand River on some level. The Grand River goes up and down pretty slowly, on the order of 6 to 12 inches in a day is a pretty good change, is a pretty typical change on the Grand River. I remember talking to the just to illustrate how quickly the water can rise or fall around these ice jams. I remember talking to the sheriff in the city of Portland, who was performing a water rescue of some residents' homes who were flooded during this ice jam a couple years ago. And she said she's about 5 feet tall. She said the water came up more than 5 feet in less than 2 minutes. So all bets are off when you start throwing ice jams into the mix. Even though the Grand River most of the time seems like this gentle giant, make no mistake, it's a giant for sure. And if you start to block the flow, you're going to be in trouble in a hurry. And so that just is to illustrate that breakup jams can cause water level to rise much, much more quickly than you'd be used to. So it can catch a lot of people off guard. The main reason this happens, and this also gets into why breakup jams tend to be more serious, is think back to the general weather conditions that led to this in the first place. We talked about a warm up and melting snow and heavy rain. There's a bunch of water trying to go through the rivers right now compared to that freeze up process. And so that is just amping up, that's just increasing the forces, raising the stakes. There's a ton of force of this flowing water coming down the river now. And for every minute, hour, and day that you're holding a good portion of that back, you have a lot of water that is backing up. And so here's an image that I took in Portland, that this ice is not moving. This is a couple hours after the initial ice jam formed. And so similar to that first image that we looked at in Muskegon, on the Muskegon River for a freeze up ice jam, now we're looking at the same thing for a breakup ice jam. And so what do you notice that's a little bit different? You're seeing specific and fairly thick sheets of blocks or pieces of ice that are jumbled up. And so I know you can't tell the scale from this either, but whereas we said for the freeze up ice jams, the general height of the roughness of the middle of the river is 1 or 2 feet at most in a freeze up ice jam. In a breakup ice jam, it often or commonly will be 3 to 4 to 6 feet or more vertical roughness, just because there's all this jumbled ice. So here is an example of some of this power of river ice breaking up. This was not filmed by me, but this is in that same place in Antioch on the Kuskokwim River. So this is a big river, and the ice has been stable for the whole winter. And in the spring, inevitably, eventually that ice is going to start moving for the first time. And what we're going to see here is this sheet of ice starts to move. And for reference, they're standing on a dike that's about 50 feet above the water surface. And so here's this whole sheet of ice starting to move. Are you guys hearing sound or no? Okay, good. It's just screaming and crazy noises, so we don't want to hear it anyway. So you can see this disturbance a little bit. Things are starting to move. So the outer edges of this sheet of ice are breaking up because they're getting pushed against this embankment, but there's so much ramming force coming behind from the rest of the sheet, the big sheet of ice, that it's pushing these 3 foot thick blocks of ice 50 feet up this slope. All right. So I'm going to pause it there so we don't throw up, but also, so that climbed 50 feet up, and now this is probably standing 6 to 8 feet, piled up 6 to 8 feet on the top of this levee. So that just tells you, again, that's Alaska, but the point is the same here. Rivers have way more power than you think they do. Here's another example. So this is from somewhere in New York. I don't know. I just found this on YouTube. I think sound might come through. It's just kind of some elevator music, but. So this is a stable ice cover, but the river's about to break up, and you'll see how quickly the water level can change. Massive flooding, huge amounts of ice moving through. And so look at all this stranded ice. I'm going to play that again, actually. Look at all this stranded ice that ends up on the sides here. Also, keep your eye on this bridge. It looks like the water almost goes over this bridge down there. Yeah, maybe not quite to the bridge. No, maybe. Pretty close. Very, very impressive. Okay. So now that I've thoroughly scared you about the power of river ice, raises the logical question, are ice jams inevitable? Whether freeze up ice jams or break up ice jams, but especially break up ice jams, like, are these inevitable? The answer is no. We kind of delineate, does eventually the ice have to go away? Yes. We all want summer to arrive, so eventually it has to. There's kind of two different ways that we can describe how the ice breaks up. The first would be this thermal, what we're calling a thermal breakup, and this is a gradual melt, a very slow and steady introduction of spring temperatures, no big rain events. Things just happen in a really calm way. At some point, the ice is losing its strength and so weak that it starts to move. But by that point, it's so thin that it can't hold back any water. It can't really form much of a jam. And many observers report that in this case, the ice just kind of disappears or melts away almost overnight. This is a thermal breakup. This is ideal. That's on the left side. On the right side is what we would call a mechanical, or sometimes known as a dynamic breakup. And so this is the opposite extreme. And unfortunately, the list of weather features that you see on the right side is much more common in Michigan. That's this really placid, gentle spring weather. Usually we end up with atmospheric violence in the spring. And so that is what we see on the right side. Rapid warm-ups. You may have heard, we've been trying to push a soundbite or a slogan in our office of rivers don't like roller coasters. Well, it's true. The rivers like these slow and steady changes, nothing happening too fast. But unfortunately, that's how the weather seems to go in the Great Lakes. And so rapid warm-ups, heavy rains, these are things that force the ice to move before it's ready, before it's weakened naturally in a way that can lower the risks. So when we get these big whipsaws, the polar vortex immediately followed by 60 degrees, that's panic time for us. That's the real danger time when we're most worried about breakup ice jams. But they're not inevitable. But it's I guess it helps keep us gainfully employed, that it doesn't always work out the way we want it to. But the reality is most years fall somewhere in the middle. There can kind of be a combination of these two things. Usually we won't be on the far left or the far right. Okay, I think that took a little bit longer. Oh, wow, that took much longer than I imagined. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Here's another picture of me with a block of ice. This time, again, I'm 6 feet tall, so this one's even thicker. Thankfully, the ice does not get that thick in Michigan. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Cord, I don't know how firm your time limit is here. I don't have an end time, so I'm happy to stick around and talk longer.
Okay, we are right on time. It's 8 o'clock right now. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask Andy any questions you might have.
I'll ask a question. Andy, first of all, thank you for a really interesting and cool presentation. I've never seen videos quite like that, so that's really neat to see. You mentioned frazzle ice forming through the process of supercooled particles within the river, and I wondered if maybe you would talk a little bit more about the process of supercooling for those present that maybe aren't familiar with that term.
Right. So because the water's flowing in the rivers, if there's a lot of turbulence in the rivers, things don't actually start to freeze right away. So the water, when it's cold, when the air is cold enough, you can actually get the water to go slightly below. I mean, we're talking fractions of a degree, but slightly below freezing before it has time to form ice crystals and freeze. So as it's forming those ice crystals, though, when it's super cooled, it is probably 31.95 degrees. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal to us, but what it results in is this stickiness that I was talking about, where it wants to attach to something and freeze solid to it. So whether that's a different block of ice or a log or a rock or whatever, as these ice particles are kind of reluctantly growing, not attached to anything because they're flowing through the river, they're looking for something to attach to so the crystal can continue growing. So that's what that stickiness is that I was kind of referring to.
Hey, Andy, I want to thank you. That was very interesting. And I have a question for you. It appears to me, if I remember correctly, you used to break up these ice jams with dynamite. Do they not do that anymore?
Great question. That is correct. They did used to break up ice jams with dynamite. They stopped doing that for a number of reasons. Actually, in Alaska, they actually used to ask the Air Force to do bombing run practice, like target practice, by dropping bombs from fighter jets on the ice jams in the rivers. And they did that for literally decades until one time they missed and bombed the village. And that was the end of that. It's a somewhat similar reason of why we are not. So first of all, the Weather Service would have no regulatory power to do that. It would have to be the Army Corps of Engineers in Michigan that would allow something like that. The environmental, the fish biologists and other types of environmental groups correctly are concerned about the amount of damage that could be done to the ecosystem by dynamiting ice jams. But in my mind, the bigger reason is actually that, so if we think about the breakup ice jams, we started with that stable ice cover. A river breaks up from upstream to downstream, which is the reverse order of the freeze up process, moves from downstream to upstream. We talked about that freeze up front moving upriver. It kind of unzips itself in the other direction when it's breaking up. So as the ice is breaking up and moving downstream and causing ice jams, in theory, the ice farther downriver is even stronger. And so if an ice jam forms and causes some flooding, if I throw a stick of dynamite in the river, I can destroy that ice jam and save my town. Yep. But what I'm going to do is send a wall of water downstream to the next city down where the ice is even stronger. And the potential ice jam that's going to form and hit them is going to be even worse than what I just went through. So you can kind of get into this situation where you save yourself and hose your neighbor down the river. And so that's in my mind probably the main reason why we're not trying to mechanically destroy ice jams anymore. Good question though, and it is asked a lot, even by elected officials in Portland. Hey, how about we throw some dynamite? Oh, we never thought of that. Brilliant.
How long ago did they stop doing that around here?
I don't know for sure. I think it was sometime back in the 70s or 80s, but I'm not exactly sure. It's been a while. And the Army Corps has said clearly there will not be any dynamite used to destroy ice jams in the state of Michigan, period. So that was pretty definitive. Great question, though.
Andy, when you think about all the technology that you have now compared to what, ice jam and river forecasting looked like 20, 30 years ago, what data do you wish you had now, or what technology do you wish you had now to try to help you forecast that you don't presently?
Ooh, that's a great question.
If there is any, I mean, unless you feel like, no, I've got all the tools I need. I have to believe, though, there's probably something there that you'd love to have or know.
There is. So the satellite era has really helped us understand the extent, especially in more rural areas. The satellite imagery is to the, not GOES imagery, but like polar orbiting satellite imagery has advanced to the point where we can kind of follow along with this breakup process as it, like we talked about the step 1, the cracks, step 2, breaking into the larger chunks. We can kind of follow along with that remotely with satellite imagery. Caveat, in Michigan, it tends to be really cloudy here in the winter and the spring, so we get hosed. But if we get a clear sunny day, we can monitor the ice remotely and add some value. But if there was one piece of data that I wish we had that we don't, it's ice thickness data. And it's really problematic to get that, because I'm never going to recommend that somebody walks out into the middle of the river and with an auger and drills a hole and measures how thick the ice is. That's definitely not safe. And so if we could magically know what that would be, that would give us a better indication of, okay, how much of the water increase are we going to need to start this fracturing breakup process? We can kind of guesstimate how thick the ice is based on, I think it's called freezing degree days. So just kind of these accumulated cold temperatures over time, kind of use that as a proxy or a guesstimate for how thick the ice might be, but it's really hard to tell. I've had a few folks offer to go measure the ice thickness, and that's not a good idea. So I think that's probably what I would say. Ice thickness data.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Mr. Dixon, for your time and your presentation. I really enjoyed it and it was really interesting. I unfortunately do have to go, but it was nice seeing you all, and I hope you have a great evening, and I hope to see you all at the next meeting.
Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for attending. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm very approachable.
Thank you.
I have a question, are there any areas in Grand Rapids that we should kind of be watching for ice jams? Any places that are particularly susceptible to them?
Another great question. Unfortunately, yes. The area in the portion of the Grand Rapids area that is most susceptible to ice jams would be Comstock Park and Plainfield Township. And the main reason for that is because the series of low-head dams that are in downtown Grand Rapids currently act to mechanically destroy any ice that is trying to move down. It shreds it and pulverizes it into these smaller pieces that don't have any strength left or capacity to form ice jams in downtown Grand Rapids. So you have to go upstream of those dams to get into the vulnerability for more significant ice jams. And so that puts you right in Comstock Park. The other amplifying factor is the I-196 bridge, or is it the I-96 bridge? Yeah, the I-96 bridge crossing the Grand River has large piers, bridge supports that are in the middle of the river. And so those can act as a focal point to impede the movement of the ice down toward the dams where it would get destroyed. So our trouble spot almost every year, we're worried about Comstock Park.
Andy, are they planning on getting rid of those dams in Grand Rapids?
Yeah, that Restore the Rapids effort would see 5 out of the 6 or 4 out of the 5, I don't know, all but one of the dam. The 6th Street Dam
Yeah.
according to the plans that I've seen, the 6th Street Dam would remain in its roughly in its current form, but the other ones would be removed. My opinion is that probably that as long as one of those is still there, it should still act to destroy the ice in a meaningful way. So I think removing 4 out of the 5 is probably not going to change things too significantly. But yes, they are talking about removing most of those.
What's their rationale for removing them?
I
Don't
this
know.
is this is out of my lane significantly, but the idea is to restore the river to a more natural sounding and looking river that doesn't have, I mean, right now when you go into downtown Grand Rapids, it's kind of boring because these low head dams maintain the water level, this fairly constant water level year round. That's what they were designed to do. That's what they do. But what is lost is the sound of a wild river and rapids. There's not really rapids in Grand Rapids anymore. So I think their goal would be to turn back the clock several decades to a more natural time that would hopefully maybe also enable recreational opportunities, things like that. But hopefully not make flooding worse.
Right.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the implications of that project in terms of
Did they
the river ice
consult you at
regime.
all?
I've been loosely involved in the process, yeah. But the permitting for that, the full review, the stamp of approval or disapproval, whatever they decide, rests with the state. Eagle, the dam safety office, is the one that's running that full environmental review. So I've offered my opinion just offered my opinion. So we'll see what happens.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I think we can wrap things up now. The only thing that we have to tease is the next meeting with Bill Marino to give us his latest update on the rest of the winter. Right now, we're thinking it's going to be the first Monday or Tuesday of December. So that's going to be less than 3 weeks from now. So not too much time. We'll be sending out an email once we get the date figured out. And is there any last minute business? Otherwise, I think we can call it a night.
Hey, Andy, just a fun fact. I just looked in the current temperature at Reed's Lake at the 2-foot level is 46 degrees.
Oh, very cool. It's going to be going down. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciated sharing my passion for river ice with you guys.
Great.
And I really do
Great
mean
job,
it.
Andy. Well done.
Thank you. I really do mean it. Reach out anytime if anybody wants to know anything. I read textbooks about river ice. I think it's so fun.
Thank you, Andy.
Hey, thank you. It was
Thanks for the
fascinating.
Thank you for the kind words, and thank you, Court, for the flexibility to pivot to Zoom here. I know this is not nobody probably wanted this to necessarily be our arrangement, but
Yeah,
tell you what, COVID
right,
has
West-
taught us a lot
yep.
of things. We can do a lot of things.
I think West Michigan Aviation Academy ended up canceling classes and evening activities. So we would not have had a venue anyway. So I'm glad we could figure out how to still have the meeting. We didn't want to cancel a weather club meeting due to weather. It happens sometimes, though. Not much you can do about that. Okay, thanks, everybody. We'll see you again, hopefully in early December.
Thank you. Good night.
Night, everybody.
Good night. Happy Thanksgiving.
And happy Thanksgiving.